During Thanksgiving dinner, my older brother stood up and proudly announced that my father had secretly transferred 51% of the company to him, the company I spent 10 years building. Then he looked at me with a crooked smile and said that by Monday morning, security would escort me out of the building with nothing. My mother simply smiled as if this ending had always been her plan. My father took a slow sip of wine, avoiding my eyes. I set my glass down on the table, because in that exact moment, I knew the game was about to change. Thank you so much for being here. Quick question before we start. Where in the world are you watching this? Comment your city or country below. I love seeing where this community reaches. One more thing, this story blends real lessons with creative storytelling for educational purposes. Names and details are fictional, and any similarities to real situations are purely by chance, but the message is worth hearing. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt longer. I took a sip of my Cabernet, a 2015 Napa Valley Reserve that Warren loved to brag about whenever he had guests, and watched Preston's face. He was waiting for my reaction. They all were. "Vanessa," he said. And now his voice took on that edge I'd heard 1,000 times before, the tone of someone who thinks they've finally won. "I want to be clear about something. Effective Monday morning, you're no longer CEO. In fact, you're no longer employed by the company at all. Security will escort you from the building, and you'll have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings into a box." Diane let out a small, satisfied sigh. Warren picked up his own wine glass, swirling it slightly, his expression unchanging. Sienna's eyes darted to me, then quickly away. I set my glass down on the white linen tablecloth carefully so it didn't make a sound, and met Preston's gaze directly. "Interesting," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "So just to clarify, Warren..." I turned to face my father, and I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross his features. "You transferred 51% of Medicor Supply Solutions to Preston 2 weeks ago. Is that correct?" Warren cleared his throat. "That's right, it was time. Preston's ready to lead, and frankly, Vanessa, you've been..." "Should I tell them now?" I interrupted, keeping my tone light, almost curious. "Or would you prefer to do the honors yourself?" The room went still. Preston's triumphant smile froze on his face like a screenshot. Diane's perfectly manicured hand, which had been reaching for her water glass, stopped mid-air. Even Sienna went rigid, though she recovered quickly, her face settling into an expression of confused concern. "Tell us what..." Diane asked, her voice sharp. She didn't like surprises, especially not ones that threatened whatever narrative she'd constructed in her head. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms loosely, and allowed myself the smallest smile. "Oh, I think Warren knows exactly what I'm talking about." I let the words hang there for a moment, watching my father's face drain of color by at least 2 shades. "Don't you, Dad?" Preston slammed his palm on the table, making the silverware jump. "What the hell are you talking about? This is done. It's over. You lost." "Lost," I repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's one way to put it, I suppose." Warren shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. For a man who'd spent 30 years running a construction supply company before retiring, he'd always been terrible at hiding discomfort. "Vanessa, if you have something to say..." "Oh, I have plenty to say." I reached down to the floor beside my chair where I'd left my leather attaché bag, the same one I'd carried into 100 client meetings, pitch sessions, and contract negotiations over the past decade. I lifted it onto my lap, unclasped it with a soft click, and pulled out my tablet. The screen lit up bright and clear. "But first," I said, standing slowly, "let me back up a little, because I think you're all missing some critical context." I walked around the table, my heels simple black Louboutins, not the flashy kind, the kind you wear when you mean business, making soft clicking sounds on the hardwood floor. I stopped beside Preston's chair, close enough that he had to crane his neck to look up at me. "See, here's the thing about family," I said, tapping the tablet screen to wake it up. "You assume loyalty. You assume that blood means something, that shared history, shared DNA, shared last names create some kind of unbreakable bond." Diane inhaled sharply. "Vanessa, what on earth..." "I spent 10 years building that company." I continued, my voice still calm, still even. 10 years. I was 24 years old when I started. I borrowed $75,000. Warren co-signed the loan. Remember that Dad and I turned a single rented warehouse in Stamford into a $12 million operation. I worked 18-hour days. I missed holidays. I missed birthdays. I built relationships with suppliers, with hospitals, with logistics networks across 6 states. I looked down at Preston. His face had gone from triumphant to wary. "And you," I said softly, "thought you could just take it." "I didn't take anything," Preston shot back, but his voice cracked slightly. "Mom and Dad gave it to me. It's theirs to give." "Is it?" I turned the tablet around so he could see the screen. "Because that's not quite what the paperwork says." Preston squinted at the document, his face going pale. Warren stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Diane made a small, choked sound. I looked at each of them in turn, my father, my mother, my brother, his wife, and felt something cold and solid settle in my chest. Not anger, not even hurt, just clarity. "Let me explain," I said, setting the tablet down on the table in front of Preston, "how we got here. The thing about building something from nothing is that you remember every single step. Not because you want to, but because each decision gets etched into your bones in a way that comfort and privilege never could. I was 24 when I walked into that credit union in Stamford with a business plan I'd rewritten 17 times. The loan officer had looked at my numbers and said, "You'll need a cosigner." Warren had signed without reading it, flipping straight to the signature page with that Mont Blanc pen he loved. "Don't make me regret this," he'd said, smiling. Back then, he still smiled at me sometimes. $75,000. At 24, it felt like an impossible fortune. I'd found a warehouse space off West Main Street, 3,200 square feet, with concrete floors that stayed cold even in summer. The first winter, I wore 2 sweatshirts and fingerless gloves while organizing inventory. My staff was me and a part-time driver named Joe, who was mostly deaf in one ear. My first contract was with a VA hospital in New Haven. Surgical supplies, unglamorous, but consistent. I drove the delivery van myself for 6 months because I couldn't afford Joe full-time. I learned to navigate loading docks at 2 a.m. to sweet-talk purchasing managers to memorize SKU numbers while packing boxes. Preston, meanwhile, was 27 and burning through his second failed startup. The first some social media platform for college athletes had cost our parents $200,000 before collapsing. The second, a meal kit delivery service, lasted longer but ended worse. By the time I'd repaid my loan in exactly 2 years, Preston owed Warren and Diane over $600,000. They never asked him to pay it back. I didn't keep score back then. Or maybe I did, and I just told myself I didn't. But I noticed things. The way Diane bragged about Preston's entrepreneurial spirit at book club. The way Warren clapped him on the shoulder every time another venture imploded, saying, "You'll figure it out, son." The way neither of them asked about my 18-hour days, or the fact that by 30, Medicor had $12 million in annual revenue and 43 employees. The company I built wasn't flashy. We had an expanded warehouse, climate-controlled storage, 6 delivery vans, and contracts with 17 hospitals. We had reliability. We had trust. And I had a problem. 2 years ago, I'd admitted something I'd been avoiding. My family was going to try to take this from me. I didn't know when or how, but I knew Preston well enough to recognize envy. I knew Warren well enough to understand he'd always seen Preston as the heir, regardless of competence. And I knew Diane would support whatever narrative kept her social standing intact. So I made a call. Sienna Reeves, corporate forensic investigator, former FBI white-collar crimes unit. Her retainer was $250,000, painful but necessary. Her job: get close to Preston, document everything, build a legal fortress he couldn't breach. "This might take time," she'd warned during our first meeting at a Norwalk coffee shop. "But if he's as entitled as you say, he'll make mistakes." She was right. 18 months ago, she'd accidentally bumped into Preston at a charity gala at the Greenwich Hyatt. Preston, recently dumped and 2 whiskeys deep, had latched onto her like a life raft. She was beautiful, charming, just impressed enough by his name-dropping to keep him talking. Within 3 months dating. Within 8 engaged. Within a year, married at the Delamar Greenwich Harbor, with Diane crying and Warren toasting his new daughter-in-law, who understood family values. I'd stood in my bridesmaid dress watching Sienna promise to love my brother, knowing every word was strategy. The fake pregnancy was Sienna's idea. "It'll make them trust me completely," she'd explained during one of our covert check-ins. "And it gives me reasons to be emotional, to ask questions, to be involved in finances." She'd ordered a medical-grade prosthetic belly. 10 months ago, she'd announced she was expecting at Sunday brunch. Diane had actually hugged her. Preston never suspected. Why would he? He'd always gotten what he wanted. A beautiful wife who adored him, a baby coming parents who bailed him out every time his credit cards maxed, which according to Sienna's documentation happened every 4 to 6 months. 6 months ago, everything accelerated. Warren had been drinking during golf season, not unusual, and I'd asked him to sign documents related to the LLC's operating agreement. Except mixed in was a trust transfer agreement granting 51% to an irrevocable trust in my name, plus a CEO authorization clause giving me unlimited power to restructure company assets. He'd signed it. Not because he was senile, but because he was drunk and arrogant and convinced I'd never challenge him. The document was legal, witnessed by my attorney, Jonathan Pierce, filed with Connecticut within 72 hours. 3 months ago, I'd incorporated Medicore Innovations Incorporated as a Delaware C Corp and systematically transferred every valuable asset from the original LLC intellectual property client contracts, proprietary systems supplier relationships. The LLC became a shell, an expensive debt-laden shell. The corporation became the actual business. Preston didn't notice. He was too busy planning his takeover. 2 weeks ago, he'd convinced Warren to sell him 51% for $450,000. Where did Preston get that money? He didn't. He'd taken a second mortgage on the house he and Sienna owned, forging her signature. She'd known, of course. She'd photographed everything. Warren, thinking he still owned the shares, thinking the drunken signing 6 months ago had been routine paperwork he'd forgotten, had happily taken Preston's money. He deposited it, spent some on a golf trip to Pebble Beach, and told Preston he was ready to pass the torch. And now here we were. I blinked. The dining room came back into focus, the chandelier, the centerpiece, Preston's frozen expression, my mother's suspended hand, my father's pale face. 5 seconds had passed, maybe 10. I looked down at the tablet, then back at my family. "Now," I said quietly, "back to tonight." The weight of 10 years hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Sienna broke the silence. "Vanessa." She said, her voice soft but somehow sharp at the edges, the way a knife sounds when it's being sharpened. She leaned forward, one hand resting on her rounded belly, that perfectly sculpted prosthetic I knew cost $3,000 and came with a money-back guarantee if anyone suspected. I've been wanting to say this for a while now, and maybe tonight is finally the right time. I set my wine glass down carefully and met her eyes. They were wide concerned, the picture of sisterly worry. She'd practiced this. We'd never discussed this specific moment, but Sienna was a professional. She knew how to play a room. "You've always been so focused on work," she continued, and I heard the calculated hesitation in her voice, as if the words were difficult but necessary. "And I admire that, I really do. But sweetheart, don't you think you've been selfish? Choosing the company over family, over relationships, over the things that actually matter? The things that actually matter," I almost smiled. "She has a point," Diane said, and there it was, the voice I'd heard my entire life, honeyed and poisonous in equal measure. My mother dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her linen napkin, a gesture so practiced it looked choreographed. "A real woman would have been married by now, Vanessa. You're 34. When I was your age, I already had 2 children and a beautiful home. What do you have? A warehouse." The dig landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Not at my success, Diane would never acknowledge that directly, but at what I supposedly lacked. The husband, the children, the performance of domestic contentment that she'd turned into an Olympic sport. "You've embarrassed us," she added, her tone shifting from concern to something colder. "All our friends ask about you, and what am I supposed to say? That my daughter spends her life in loading docks and boardrooms, refusing every eligible man who shows interest. It's not natural." Warren cleared his throat, the sound deep and authoritative, the same noise he used to make before delivering verdicts when Preston and I were kids. It always meant he was about to say something he considered profound. "Preston understands what it means to carry on a legacy," he said, looking at my brother with something close to pride. "He understands that business is about more than spreadsheets and contracts. It's about vision, about leadership." His gaze shifted to me, and I saw the disappointment there, worn smooth by decades of repetition. "You're too emotional to run a company, Vanessa. You always have been. You take things personally. You can't separate business from feelings." The irony was almost beautiful. This man who'd nearly bankrupted his own construction supply company twice because he refused to fire his incompetent college roommate, who'd co-signed loans for Preston's failures because he couldn't say no to his son, who was sitting here right now defending a decision he'd made while drunk, was calling me emotional. "I think what Dad's trying to say," Preston interjected, and his voice had taken on that magnanimous quality he used when he thought he'd won, "is that it's time. And you've had your shot, Vanessa. You built something, I'll give you that. But building and leading are different things. You're a worker bee. I'm the guy who sees the bigger picture." He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the armrest, and I watched the little tells I'd cataloged over 37 years of sharing DNA with this man. The slight smirk, the lifted chin, the way his left eye twitched when he was lying to himself about his own competence. "So here's how this is going to work," he continued. "You're going to pack up your personal items this weekend. Take your diplomas, your photos, whatever motivational posters you've got on the walls. And Monday morning when you show up, if you show up, security will be waiting. You'll have 1 hour. After that, your key card gets deactivated and your email access gets terminated." "Preston," Sienna said softly, her hand covering his on the table. I watched her fingers, thin, elegant, topped with a French manicure, squeeze his knuckles gently. "Maybe we should—" "No." He cut her off, though his voice softened when he looked at her. "She needs to hear this. It's business, babe. It's not personal." "It's not personal." The most personal thing in the world delivered with that phrase. I let the silence stretch, let them sit in what they thought was victory. Diane had that satisfied expression she wore when she'd successfully orchestrated something, a seating arrangement, a confrontation, a family hierarchy reassertion. Warren was nodding slowly as if Preston had just delivered the Gettysburg Address. Preston himself looked like he'd finally stepped out of his older brother's shadow and into sunlight. And Sienna was perfect. Her face showed just the right amount of discomfort, like she understood this was necessary, but wished it could be gentler. When she reached for her water glass, I saw it, the slight tremor in her hand. So subtle that anyone else would have missed it, or attributed it to pregnancy hormones, or the emotional weight of the moment. But I knew better. That tremor was effort. The physical cost of maintaining a performance this flawless, this sustained. $250,000 bought excellence, but it didn't buy ease. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor with a soft sound that cut through the room's charged quiet. Everyone's eyes followed me as I stood, smoothed the front of my charcoal silk blouse theory purchased on sale. Because I'd learned early that you didn't need to spend obscenely to look competent and walk toward the sideboard. The mahogany piece stood against the far wall between two windows that overlooked the garden. It was the kind of furniture Diane had spent months selecting, reading catalogs, and dragging Warren to antique stores in Fairfield County. Because everything in this house had to tell a specific story about wealth and taste and permanence. My leather attaché bag sat on top right where I'd placed it when we'd arrived 2 hours ago for pre-dinner drinks, before the turkey and the cranberry sauce and the stuffing, before Preston's little announcement, before any of this. I unclasped it, the sound crisp and clear, and pulled out my tablet. The screen glowed to life at my touch, bright in the chandelier's warm light. "Vanessa, what are you doing?" Diane's voice carried an edge of uncertainty now. I didn't answer, just walked back toward the table, my heels clicking with each step, the tablet held loosely in one hand. Preston was watching me with narrowed eyes, Warren with confusion, Diane with something approaching alarm. Sienna's face remained carefully neutral, but when our eyes met for half a second, I caught it, the microscopic acknowledgement, the readiness. I stopped behind Preston's chair, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw had tightened. "There's something," I said quietly, setting the tablet on the table in front of him, "you all need to see." The screen cast a cold blue glow across Preston's face as he leaned forward, squinting at the document I'd pulled up. Warren shifted in his seat, craning his neck to see. Diane set down her fork with a soft clink, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to something more uncertain. I tapped the screen, zooming in on the header. Irrevocable Trust Agreement dated May 15, 2025. Grantor Warren Mitchell beneficiary. Vanessa Mitchell trustee Jonathan Pierce Esquire. The document was formatted in that dense, single-spaced legal text that most people find impenetrable deliberately, so I'd always suspected. But the key paragraphs were highlighted in yellow, impossible to miss. I'd made sure of that this afternoon right after Preston's smug text message Sunday dinner at 7. "Dad has big news. You're going to want to be there." "This," I said, my voice steady and clear, "is a trust agreement, specifically an irrevocable trust. Do you know what that means?" Preston, he didn't answer. His jaw had gone tight, that little muscle near his ear jumping the way it always did when he was trying to process something that threatened his world view. "It means," I continued, "that once it's signed and executed, it can't be undone. Not by the grantor, that's Dad, and not by anyone else. The assets transferred into the trust are permanent, final." Warren's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, moving around the table to get a better look at the screen. He bent over Preston's shoulder, his reading glasses the ones he refused to wear in public because they made him look old perched on his nose. "I don't..." He trailed off his finger, hovering over the signature line at the bottom of page 3. His signature. Unmistakably his, with that distinctive loop on the W and the aggressive slash through the double L. "I don't remember signing this." "May 15th, I said. 6 months ago. It was a Thursday. You'd spent the afternoon at the club, 9 holes with your golf buddies plus drinks in the clubhouse after. You came home around 6, poured yourself a bourbon, and I asked you to review some documents related to the LLC's operating agreement." The memory was playing across his face, now hazy and incomplete. I could see him trying to grasp it like trying to catch smoke. "You were in a good mood," I added. "You'd shot an 83, your best round all season." "I still don't," Warren started, but his voice lacked conviction. "You signed 7 documents that night, Dad. LLC tax filings, updated insurance certificates, a new lease addendum for the Stamford facility." I paused, letting that sink in. "And this trust agreement. You flipped through it, made a joke about lawyers using too many words, and signed on page 3 and page 7. "This is bullshit," Preston said, but his voice had gone thin. "You tricked him. He was drunk. He was tipsy," I corrected. "There's a legal distinction. And more importantly, he was competent. The document was witnessed by Jonathan Pierce, a licensed attorney in the state of Connecticut. Jonathan drove out to the house specifically for that purpose. He spoke with Dad for 20 minutes, asked him direct questions about his understanding of what he was signing, and determined that he had full mental capacity. I swiped to the next page where Jonathan's witness statement was typed in crisp, formal language. "I, Jonathan Pierce, attorney at law, do hereby attest that Warren Mitchell appeared before me on this date, demonstrated clear understanding of the terms and implications of this document, and signed of his own free will without coercion or duress." "Jonathan is your golf buddy," Preston said, desperately looking at Warren. "He's your lawyer. He's the company's lawyer," I interrupted. "And he did exactly what I paid him to do, which was his job." Diane's hand had moved to her throat, fingers pressing against the strand of pearls she wore like armor to every family gathering. "Vanessa, this is you can't what, Mother?" I turned to face her and I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. "Can't protect myself, can't plan ahead, can't be smarter than you thought I was." She flinched, actually flinched like I'd raised a hand. Warren sank back into his chair, his face the color of old paper. "What did I sign exactly?" I zoomed in on section 3.2 titled Transfer of Assets. You transferred 51% ownership of Medicor Supply Solutions, LLC, to an irrevocable trust established in my name. The trust is managed by Jonathan Pierce as trustee, but I'm the sole beneficiary, which means I control the majority stake in the company, permanently, legally, irrevocably. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier. Preston's hands had curled into fists on the table knuckles, white. Diane was staring at her plate like it held answers. Warren just looked old. Suddenly visibly old. "That's not possible," Preston said finally. "Dad sold me those shares 2 weeks ago. I paid $450,000. You paid $450,000 for shares Dad didn't own anymore," I said. "Shares he'd already transferred to my trust 6 months prior, which means you bought nothing, Preston. You paid nearly $500,000 for air." "Bullshit." The word exploded out of him loud enough that Sienna jumped in her seat, her hand flying to her belly in a gesture that looked maternal and protective, but was really just good acting. "This is fraud. It's illegal. I'll sue. I'll take you to court. You'll lose," I said simply, because everything I did was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was witnessed by a licensed attorney. I swiped to another document, this one titled CEO Authorization Clause. "And while we're on the subject of things Dad signed while tipsy," Warren made a small choked sound. "This," I explained, "is an addendum to the LLC's operating agreement. It grants the sitting CEO, that would be me, unlimited authority to restructure company assets, transfer intellectual property, renegotiate contracts, and reorganize the corporate structure without requiring board approval or shareholder consent." Preston leaned in, reading fast, his lips moving slightly. No, this can't. There's no way." "There's every way," I said. "Dad signed it the same night, same bourbon, same good mood after shooting 83. But why would I?" Warren looked at me genuinely confused, and for a moment, I almost felt something like pity. Almost. "Because I asked you to," I said, "and because you trusted me. Or maybe because you didn't think it mattered. You've never taken the company seriously, Dad. Not really. It wasn't construction. It wasn't your world. So when I asked you to sign documents that would streamline operations and improve efficiency, you didn't see any reason to read the fine print." Diane's voice was sharp, cutting through the fog. "So what? You have some paperwork. Preston still owns the actual company, the warehouse, the equipment, the inventory, the contracts." She looked at Preston, then at Warren, gathering confidence. "The trust is just legal nonsense. The real assets, the things that actually make money, those belong to Preston now." Preston nodded, latching onto this like a drowning man finding a rope. "Exactly. You can have your 51% of nothing, Vanessa. I own the physical business. The building, the trucks, the medical devices, the supplier relationships. Do you?" I asked softly. The question hung there. Preston's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, suspicion, anger, and finally creeping dread. "About those assets," I said, and I let myself smile. Just slightly, just enough. I swiped left on the tablet screen, and a new document appeared, corporate and clinical, formatted with the kind of precision that legal filings demand. "Certificate of Incorporation, State of Delaware Medicor Innovations Incorporated, filed August 12th, 2025. Preston's head snapped up. "What the hell is that?" "That," I said, "is the future, or more accurately, the present. 3 months ago, I incorporated a new company, Delaware C Corp, which, if you knew anything about business structure, you'd recognize as the gold standard for corporations in the United States. Better liability protection, more flexibility, investor-friendly. I zoomed in on the filing details: registered agent, business purpose, authorized shares. Everything pristine and legal and permanent. Medicor Innovations, Inc. I continued, my voice steady, is a completely separate legal entity from Medicor Supply Solutions, LLC. Different tax ID, different corporate structure, different ownership. You can't just... Preston started, but I held up one hand. "Let me finish." I swiped again, pulling up a series of documents that I'd organized into a folder labeled Asset Transfer. August 2025. Using the CEO authorization clause that Dad signed, the one we just discussed, I systematically transferred every valuable asset from the LLC to the new corporation. The first document filled the screen Intellectual Property Transfer Agreement. Every patent we hold, I said, every trademark, every proprietary system, formula, or process, the cooling system for temperature-sensitive medical devices, the inventory management software, the supplier vetting protocols I developed over 8 years, all of it, transferred to Medicore Innovations Incorporated on August 15th. Warren was staring at the screen like it was written in a foreign language. Diane's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness evaporating. I swiped to the next document. Client Contract Amendments, Batch Transfer. Our contracts with hospitals and healthcare systems, I explained. I renegotiated every single one. Some required amendments. Some were simple reassignments allowed under the original terms. But the result is the same. Every major client we have is now contracted with the corporation, not the LLC. That's not possible, Preston said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Costco wouldn't just... Costco, Walmart, CVS, Kaiser Permanente, Atlantic Health System, Yale New Haven Hospital. I rattled off the names like a grocery list. I met with every purchasing director personally, explained that we were restructuring for expansion, assured them nothing would change in terms of service delivery or pricing. Most of them signed the amendments within a week. I pulled up an email dated September 3rd from Marcus Carter. The subject line read, Re-Contract Amendment, Approved. Marcus sent this 6 weeks ago, I said, turning the tablet so Preston could read it. He actually thanked me for being proactive, said it showed strong leadership. Preston's face had taken on a grayish tint. Sienna reached for his hand, squeezed it gently, another perfect gesture of wifely support. I caught the briefest flicker of something in her eyes. Not quite amusement, but close. You're lying, Diane said suddenly, her voice sharp with desperation. You're making this up. There's no way you could have moved everything without someone noticing. I'm not making anything up, Mother. I swiped to a PDF labeled Trademark Registration Certificates, USPTO. Every trademark associated with Medicore is now registered to the corporation. The name, the logo, even the tagline we use on delivery vans. The United States Patent and Trademark Office has very clear records. Warren stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward. Show me the supplier contracts. I obliged, pulling up a spreadsheet. Rows and rows of company names, contact information, contract dates. Every supplier relationship we've built. Medical device manufacturers, packaging companies, logistics partners. I reached out to each one over the summer, explained we were transitioning to a new corporate entity. Most didn't care, they just wanted to keep doing business. A few required new vendor applications, which I submitted and got approved. This is insane, Preston said, and for the first time I heard something crack in his voice. Not anger, fear. You can't just steal an entire company. I didn't steal anything, I said calmly. I restructured. There's a difference, Preston. Stealing would be illegal. What I did was use the authority Dad legally granted me to reorganize corporate assets in a way that protects the business and its future. Protects it from what Warren demanded. I looked at him directly. From you, from him, from the risk that you'd hand over something I built to someone who has no idea how to run it. The words landed like stones in water. Warren's face went red, then white. Diane made a small, choked sound. So let me make this very clear. I continued, and I felt the satisfaction of 10 years of planning settle into my bones. Medicore Supply Solutions, LLC, the company you think you own, Preston. The one Dad thinks he signed over is now an empty shell. It has a name. It has a lease on a warehouse. And it has debts. Quite a lot of debts, actually, but we'll get to that. I closed the current folder and opened another labeled Medicore Innovations Inc. Current Status. The corporation, on the other hand, has everything that makes money, the intellectual property. The client contracts worth $8 million annually, the supplier relationships, the proprietary systems, the reputation, the future. Preston was shaking his head, a repetitive, almost mechanical motion. No, no, this isn't Dad. Tell her she can't do this. But Warren wasn't looking at Preston. He was looking at me, and I saw the moment it clicked. The moment he understood exactly what I'd done. You own 51% of nothing, I said quietly. And Dad, you sold Preston shares of something you didn't own anymore. Shares that were already transferred to my trust 6 months before you took his money. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. Which brings me, I said, swiping to a new document, a bank statement with Wells Fargo letterhead, to an important question. Preston, where exactly did you get $450,000? The question hung in the air like smoke. Preston's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Warren, then at Diane, then back at me, and I watched the calculations play across his face lie deflect attack. He was running through his options, trying to find an exit that didn't exist. I didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, I zoomed in on the bank statement, the Wells Fargo logo crisp at the top, and scrolled to a specific date, May 16, 2025, the day after Warren signed the trust documents. This, I said, turning the tablet so everyone at the table could see, is Dad's business checking account, the one he set up years ago for what he calls consulting work. Y'all, I used air quotes, let the skepticism drip into my voice. Pay attention to this line item right here. My finger hovered over a single entry. May 16th, 2025. Trust transfer. Share offset. Minus $504,000. Adjay consulting fees. Warren leaned forward, squinting even with his reading glasses. The color had drained from his face so completely he looked like a photograph of himself bleached and two-dimensional. That's not, he started, but his voice cracked. That's exactly what it looks like, I said. When you signed the trust agreement, Dad, the 51% ownership transfer was recorded as a debt offset. Specifically, it was offset against $504,000 in consulting fees that you'd invoiced the company for over the past 3 years. I swiped to another document, a spreadsheet I'd compiled myself, color-coded and meticulously detailed. Here's the fun part. These are all the invoices you submitted to Medicore Supply Solutions. $8,000 here, $12,000 there, $15,000 for strategic planning consultation in March of 2023. They add up to $504,000. Diane's hand was pressed flat against the table, knuckles white. Warren, what is she talking about? Consulting fees for services never rendered, I said before he could answer. Dad never consulted on anything. He never attended a single client meeting, never reviewed a contract, never offered strategic advice that I actually used. But every month, like clockwork, an invoice would appear, and every month I'd pay it. You approved those payments, Warren said, and there was something desperate in his voice now, something pleading. You signed off on them. I did, I agreed. Because you're my father. Because I thought stupidly, apparently, that keeping the peace was worth $8,000 to $15,000 a month. I thought you'd eventually get bored and stop. I didn't realize you were building yourself a retirement fund on my back. The words were harsh, and I meant them to be. Warren flinched like I'd slapped him. So when you signed the trust agreement, I continued. The transfer of shares wasn't treated as a sale. It was treated as a debt repayment. You owed me $504,000, Dad. The shares were your way of paying me back, which means no cash changed hands. No check was written. It was just an accounting adjustment. I let that sink in for 3 full seconds, which also means I added that you never actually felt like you'd lost anything. The money you'd taken was invisible to you. The shares felt like they were still yours. So when Preston came to you 2 weeks ago with an offer, I swiped to a more recent statement dated November 10th, 2025. 2 weeks ago, another highlighted line. November 10th, 2025. Deposit. Wire transfer. Plus $450,000. From Preston Mitchell. You thought, why not? I finished. Preston's offering cash, real spendable money, and you still think you own the shares, because that debt offset from May felt like paperwork, not a real transaction. So you took his $450,000 and told yourself it was a legitimate sale. Warren's breathing had gone shallow. He was staring at the bank statement like it was a rattlesnake coiled on the table. You sold the same shares twice, I said quietly. Once to me to clear a debt you didn't think was real, and once to Preston for cash you definitely knew was real. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the house, the hum of the heating system, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to have stopped. Then Preston exploded. "You stole from me." He shoved his chair back so hard it toppled over, clattering against the hardwood. He was on his feet, jabbing a finger at Warren, his face gone a mottled red. "You took my money. $450,000 for nothing." "Preston, I didn't know." Warren stammered, half rising from his seat. "You didn't know." Preston's voice cracked on the last word, shooting up an octave. "You didn't know. How do you not know what you own?" "I was going to, I thought." Warren looked at me, then at Diane, searching for someone to rescue him. "Vanessa, you have to understand, you never meant to get caught," I said. "There's a difference." Diane was staring at Warren like she'd never seen him before. "Warren, where did the $450,000 go?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I'd already checked. Golf trip to Pebble Beach, new Lexus for Diane, a birthday present she'd gushed about on Facebook, $10,000 on a wine auction, the rest sitting in their joint checking account, slowly being eaten by their lifestyle. "Preston." Sienna's voice cut through the chaos, quiet but sharp. She was still seated, her hands folded over her belly, her face carefully arranged into an expression of confused concern. "What $450,000? Preston turned to her and I saw panic flash across his face. "It's Babe, it's fine. I told you I was handling the company acquisition." "You said you were using savings," Sienna interrupted, and her voice was so perfectly pitched, confused, a little hurt, a little scared that I almost wanted to applaud. "You said we had enough set aside." "We did," Preston said quickly. We do. I needed to supplement it, just a little." "Supplement it? How?" She leaned forward slightly, one hand still on her belly. "Preston, we have a baby coming. If you spent our savings—" "I didn't spend our savings," he snapped, then caught himself, softened his tone. "I borrowed some money. That's all. It's fine. It's going to be fine." "Borrowed?" I repeated, and I let the word hang there for a beat. "That's interesting. Borrowed from where exactly?" Preston's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to Sienna, then away. Sienna's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together, and her eyes, those expressive, intelligent eyes, widened just slightly, enough to suggest dawning realization, enough to plant a seed of dread. "Preston." Her voice had gone very small. "Where did you borrow the money?" Preston's mouth worked silently for a moment, opening and closing like he was trying to find words that wouldn't damn him further. But before he could form a response, Sienna moved. She reached into the small designer clutch she'd placed beside her chair hours ago, a cream-colored Bottega Veneta that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and pulled out her phone. Her movements were deliberate, almost slow motion, and I recognized the choreography. We'd never discussed this specific moment, but Sienna was a professional. She knew how to time a reveal. "Preston, she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I got a notification on my phone 3 days ago from the bank." She tapped the screen, her French manicure catching the chandelier light. "I thought it was spam at first, one of those phishing attempts, but then I called Wells Fargo to check." She turned the phone so the whole table could see. On the screen was a scanned document, the kind you get when you request records through a bank's mobile app. Bold text at the top read, "Second mortgage agreement." Warren leaned forward despite himself. Diane's hand went to her throat again, that nervous gesture she couldn't seem to stop. $450,000. Sienna continued, and now her voice cracked on the number. "Against our house. The house we bought together. The house where we're supposed to raise our baby." She swiped through the document pages, and I could see key sections highlighted: loan amount, property, address, interest rate. And there on page 4, 2 signature lines. One in Preston's aggressive scrawl, one in a feminine hand that looked like Sienna's, but wasn't quite right. The loop on the S slightly off the tail on the A too short. "You forged my signature," Sienna said, and it wasn't a question. It was an accusation delivered with the perfect mixture of hurt and disbelief. She looked up at Preston, Her eyes wide and shimmering. Were those actual tears? Or was she just that good and repeated, "You forged my signature on a second mortgage without telling me." "I didn't forge anything." Preston's voice came out strangled defensive. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, clutching her phone against her chest. "Sienna, babe, listen, I needed the money for the company, for us, for our future." "You mortgaged our house." Her voice rose, no longer trembling, but sharp with what sounded like genuine panic. "Preston, we have a baby coming in 8 weeks. What if we can't make the payments? What if we lose everything?" "We're not going to lose anything," Preston insisted, but he was looking at me now, not at her. "This was an investment. Dad sold me the company. I own it now. The mortgage will pay itself off, except you don't own the company," I interrupted quietly. "We've established that. What you own, Preston, is debt." I reached across the table and tapped my tablet awake. The screen had gone dark while Sienna performed her scene, but now it illuminated again, casting that familiar cold glow across the remnants of dinner. Half-eaten turkey congealed gravy, the autumn centerpiece looking suddenly absurd in the middle of this disaster. "Let's talk about what you actually bought," I said, or more specifically, what you're now liable for. I opened a different folder, this one labeled LLC Liabilities, Current Status. The spreadsheet that appeared was color-coded red for outstanding balances, yellow for upcoming payments, orange for overdue accounts, mostly red. At the bottom in bold, total outstanding debt, $1,847,392.18. Preston's face went through several shades, finally settling on a grayish white that reminded me of old newspaper. "What? What is that?" "That," I said, "is every debt currently attached to Medicor Supply Solutions, LLC, the company you thought you were buying, the one you paid $450,000 for." I zoomed in on the first line item, letting everyone see the details. Stamford Warehouse Mortgage. Principal balance $890,447.32. Monthly payment $7,234.19. Status current. The warehouse, I explained, has a mortgage. I took it out 6 years ago to purchase the property outright instead of leasing. Made good business sense at the time. The monthly payment is manageable when the company is operational and generating revenue. Less manageable when the company is an empty shell. Preston's hand had started shaking. Sienna was staring at the screen, one hand still on her belly, her expression gone from hurt to something approaching horror. I scrolled down. Landlord deposit penalty. Amount due, $320,000. Due date, December 15th, 2025. Status pending litigation. "And this is fun," I said, and I didn't bother hiding the edge in my voice. 3 months ago, when I restructured, I broke the lease on the Stamford facility, gave proper notice, followed all the protocols. But there was a clause. There's always a clause about early termination. The landlord is owed the remainder of the lease term as a penalty. $320,000. He's already filed an injunction to seize the property, and his background check on the current LLC owner came back problematic. Preston made a small strangled sound. I scrolled again. Equipment loans, various. Total balance $419,883.47. Monthly aggregate payment $8,890. Status current. These are loans for the delivery vans, the climate-controlled storage units, the inventory management hardware, all financed, all tied to the LLC, all now your responsibility. Vendor payables. Total outstanding $170,061.39. Status 30 to 90 days overdue. And these, I finished, are unpaid invoices from suppliers, medical device manufacturers, packaging companies, shipping contractors. I've been slow-walking payments for the past 2 months as part of the restructure. They're getting antsy. Some of them are threatening collections. I closed the spreadsheet and looked up at Preston. He was frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles had gone bone white. "So to summarize," I said, You paid $450,000 borrowed against your house, apparently without your wife's knowledge or consent to acquire ownership of a company that owes $1.8 million. Congratulations, Preston. That's what we call a bad investment. Diane found her voice first shrill and desperate. Vanessa, you did this on purpose. You trapped him. I protected myself, I corrected. There's a difference. Warren was still staring at his plate, his face slack. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Preston's breathing had gone ragged. I can't. There's no way. I know you don't, I said, which brings me to my favorite part of this whole situation. I zoomed into a specific section of the LLC's operating agreement highlighted in yellow. Here's the best part, I said, and I let myself smile again. The clause I'd zoomed into was buried in Section 7, 4 of the LLC's operating agreement. Nestled between provisions about fiscal year designations and annual meeting requirements, the kind of place most people's eyes would glaze over if they bothered reading at all, which of course Preston hadn't. I read it aloud, letting each word land with the weight it deserved. Section 7.4, subsection C. In the event that a single shareholder acquires majority ownership defined as 51% or greater equity, stake said shareholder shall assume personal guarantor status for all outstanding debts, liabilities, and financial obligations of the limited liability company, effective immediately upon transfer of ownership. I looked up from the tablet. Preston's face had gone beyond pale into something approaching translucent. In plain English, I continued my voice conversational, almost friendly. The moment you became the majority owner, the moment Dad's transfer supposedly went through. The moment you paid your $450,000, you became personally responsible for every single dollar the LLC owes. The warehouse mortgage, the landlord penalty, the equipment loans, the vendor payables, all $1.8 million of it. Preston's hands had started trembling visibly now, a fine shake that traveled up his arms. No, he said, and his voice came out thin and reedy. No, that can't be legal. It's completely legal, I assured him. It's standard language in LLC operating agreements, especially for family businesses. It protects the company. Well, it protects me from majority owners making reckless decisions. If you want control, you assume the risk. That's how business works. You trapped me, he said again, but there was no fight left in the words, just hollow realization. You trapped yourself, I corrected. You wanted the company so badly you didn't do due diligence. You didn't hire a lawyer to review the operating agreement. You didn't ask for a financial audit. You just assumed because you've always assumed that things would work out in your favor because they always have. I closed the folder on the tablet and set it down gently like I was putting away a weapon I no longer needed. So let's review, I said. You paid $450,000 that you borrowed by forging your wife's signature on a second mortgage. You bought a controlling stake in a company that's actually an empty shell with $1.8 million in debts. And because you now own 51%, you are personally, legally, irrevocably liable for every cent. Preston made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like air escaping from something punctured. Then he slumped forward, his elbows hitting the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. His head dropped into his hands, and for a moment, I thought he might actually cry. He didn't. Preston had always been too proud for that, but his shoulders shook twice before he went completely still. Diane found her voice in the silence that followed. You vindictive? She didn't get to finish. My phone, which I'd set face down on the table beside my wine glass hours ago, suddenly buzzed with an incoming call. The vibration was loud in the stunned quiet, and the screen lit up bright enough to cast shadows. I glanced down. Marcus Carter, Costco Mobile. The timing was almost too perfect. I picked up the phone, swiped to answer, and before anyone could object or Preston could process what was happening, tapped the speaker icon. Marcus. I said my voice warm and professional in a way that must have sounded surreal given the wreckage of the dinner table around me. Good to hear from you. Vanessa. Marcus's voice filled the room, friendly and energetic in that way he always was after 6 p.m. when he'd finally cleared his email backlog and could focus on the parts of his job he actually enjoyed. "I hope I'm not interrupting your Thanksgiving dinner. I just wanted to confirm we're still on for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at One Financial Center, right?" I saw Preston's head snap up, confusion cutting through his devastation. "That's right," I confirmed. 28th floor. I'll have coffee ready." "Perfect. I just finished reviewing the Series B term sheet with our CFO and legal team. Vanessa, I have to say $28 million is a strong round. The valuation looks more than fair given your growth trajectory, and the investor syndicate you've put together is impressive. We're excited to be part of this next phase." Every word Marcus spoke was like another nail. I watched Preston's expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally dawning horror. "I appreciate that, Marcus," I said. "Medicore Innovations has some exciting developments in the pipeline. That new cooling system integration we discussed last month is testing even better than projected." "That's what I like to hear. Listen, I've already sent the updated contract amendments to your legal team. Once we close the Series B, we'll be looking at expanding our order volume significantly. Possibly 20 to 30% year-over-year growth." "Sounds good," I said, and I let myself glance at Preston, who was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "We'll have capacity ready." "Excellent. I'll let you get back to your family dinner. See you tomorrow, Vanessa. Happy Thanksgiving." "Wait," Preston's voice cracked on the word. "Wait, what meeting?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Marcus spoke again, his tone had shifted from warm to professional, confused. "I'm sorry, who is this?" Preston opened his mouth, closed it, looked at me, looked at the phone. His brain was clearly trying to catch up to process what he was hearing against what he thought he knew. "This is Preston Mitchell," he managed finally. I'm the new owner of Medicore." Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear Marcus flipping through his mental files trying to place the name. "I'm not sure I understand," Marcus said carefully. "Vanessa, is everything okay?" The question hung in the air. Everyone at the table was frozen. Preston half standing, his knuckles white against the chair back. Sienna with one hand still on her belly, eyes wide. Diane looking between me and the phone like she was watching a tennis match. Warren staring into the middle distance like he'd checked out of reality entirely. I picked up the phone, held it closer, but kept it on speaker. "Everything's fine, Marcus," I said, and my voice was steady, calm, almost amused. "Just a little family confusion. Preston is my brother. He's had some misunderstandings about the business structure." "Ah," Marcus said, and I heard the diplomatic retreat in that single syllable. "Well, I'll leave you to sort that out. But just to be clear, Vanessa, our contracts are with Medicore Innovations, Inc., correct? The Delaware Corporation." "That's correct," I confirmed. "And you're still CEO and majority shareholder of that entity." "I am." "Good. Good. Then I'll see you tomorrow morning." Another pause. "You know, Vanessa, I've worked with a lot of suppliers over the years. One thing I've learned is that the good ones are the ones who plan ahead, who see around corners, who don't just react to problems but prevent them." He let that sit for a beat. "I'm glad we're working with you." It was a compliment, but it was also a message for me and for anyone else listening. Marcus was a VP at one of the largest retailers in the country. He didn't get there by being careless about his supplier relationships. "I appreciate that, Marcus," I said. "See you tomorrow." I ended the call and set the phone down slowly, deliberately. Preston was still half standing, frozen in that awkward crouch. His mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. "That was Marcus Carter," I said unnecessarily. "Vice President of Operations at Costco, one of Medicore Innovations' largest clients. Tomorrow I'm meeting with him and a group of investors to close a $28 million Series B funding round. The company you thought you owned, it's about to be valued at $85 million. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip. "The company you actually bought," I continued. "The LLC with $1.8 million in debts that you're now personally liable for, that's worth less than nothing. Congratulations, Preston. You just paid $450,000 to destroy your own financial future." I turned my attention back to the phone, away from the wreckage of my family, and let my voice smooth into the professional tone I used with clients. Calm, confident, utterly unbothered by the chaos 3 feet away. "Just a family dinner, Marcus," I said. A little more dramatic than usual, but nothing I can't handle. "I'll see you tomorrow morning at One Financial Center." "Looking forward to it, Vanessa." There was warmth in Marcus's voice, the kind that came from years of working with someone who delivered on their promises. "You know, I've been in this industry 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of suppliers who've genuinely innovated. Medicor Innovations is going to change healthcare supply chains. I really believe that." "I appreciate the vote of confidence," I said. "We'll see you at 9. I ended the call and set the phone down on the table with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than it should have in the silence that followed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away seconds that felt like hours. Then Preston exploded. "That's my company!" His voice cracked, shooting high and raw. He was on his feet now, really on his feet, not that half crouch from before. His chair had fallen backward again, and he didn't seem to notice or care. "Those are my clients, my contracts. You can't just take them." I met his eyes, and I kept my voice level, almost bored. "They're not your clients, Preston. They never were. They signed contracts with me, with Medicor Innovations, Inc. They don't know you. They don't work with you. Marcus Carter just spent 5 minutes on the phone with me confirming a $28 million funding round, and he had no idea who you were when you spoke up. Does that sound like your client to you?" "But the company, the LLC," I interrupted. "The one you bankrupted the moment you took ownership, that company had clients 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago. But 3 months ago, when I restructured, every single one of them chose to stay with me. Not with the LLC, not with some hypothetical future owner, with me." Preston's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out except a kind of strangled wheezing sound. Warren stood slowly, his hands braced on the table like he needed the support. His face had taken on that grayish color again, the one that made him look decades older than 62. "Vanessa," he said, and his voice was quiet, now stripped of all the bluster and authority he'd carried earlier in the evening. "Please, we can fix this. We can work something out. We're family." "Fix what exactly, Dad?" The question came out sharp cold. I turned to face him fully, and I saw him flinch. "Fix the fact that you sold the same shares twice. Fix the fact that Preston now owes $1.8 million he doesn't have. Fix the fact that you spent his $450,000 on golf trips and Mom's birthday Lexus." I paused, let that settle. "Or are you talking about fixing the $504,000 you embezzled from me over the past 3 years? The word embezzled hit the table like a grenade. Warren's face went from gray to white. Diane made a small, choked sound. I picked up the tablet again, swiped to a folder I'd prepared weeks ago. The spreadsheet that appeared was meticulous, I'd made sure of that. Every line item color-coded. Every invoice scanned and attached. Every payment traced through 3 years of bank records. "Here," I said, turning the screen toward Warren, "in case you've forgotten." The header read, "Warren Consulting, LLC. Invoice history, 2022 to 2025. Below it, row after row of entries. August 12th, 2022, strategic planning consultation, $8,000. September 15th, 2022, market analysis review, $12,500, October 20th, 2022, operational efficiency assessment, $15,000, 00, November 18th, 2022, client relations advisory, $9,200, and on and on and on. 3 years of monthly invoices, every single one paid by Medicor Supply Solutions, LLC. Every single one for services that were never rendered. $504,000, I said. Billed to the company through your consulting LLC. For strategic planning, you never did. Market analyses, you never conducted. Operational assessments, you never performed. You invoiced me every month, Dad. And every month I paid you, because I thought stupidly that it was easier to keep the peace than to call you out on it. Warren's hands were shaking now. I didn't think of it as stealing, I finished. What did you think it was? I helped you. The words burst out of him, desperate and defensive. I co-signed your loan. I gave you credibility when you were just a kid with a business plan. You wouldn't have gotten anywhere without me. You co-signed a $75,000 loan 10 years ago, I said, which I repaid in full with interest within 2 years. After that, every dollar the company made, I made. Every client I landed. Every system I built. You didn't help with any of it. You just sent invoices. He stopped, swallowed hard. Things were tight after I retired. Your mother and I had expenses. Then you should have asked me for a loan, I snapped. Or for a job, or for anything honest. Instead, you stole from me, hid it in fake consulting fees. And this is the truly impressive part, you used that stolen money as justification for taking my company away from me. Diane's voice cut through shrill and disbelieving. Warren, you stole from our daughter. It was the first time all evening she'd sounded genuinely shocked, not at me, but at him. Warren turned to her, his face crumpling. Diane, it wasn't like that. You billed her for work you never did. Diane's hand was at her throat again, gripping her pearls like they were a lifeline. For 3 years, that's theft, Warren. That's criminal. It was just I thought of it as what? I asked quietly. As your due, as some kind of parental tax. He didn't answer, couldn't answer. I closed the spreadsheet and set the tablet down one final time. You stole from me, I said. Preston tried to steal from me, and Mom, I looked at Diane, who'd gone very still. You stood by and enabled all of it because you cared more about appearances than about what was actually happening. The silence that followed felt like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Then I heard at the doorbell. A single clear chime that cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone's head turned toward the hallway. Actually, I said, and I felt something settle in my chest, something final and irreversible. It gets worse. I stood the movement slow and deliberate and walked toward the hallway. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs as the others followed. Preston stumbling slightly, Warren's heavy footsteps, Diane's heels clicking on the hardwood, Sienna moving more carefully with one hand still on her belly. The foyer was exactly as pretentious as the rest of the house marble floors, a crystal chandelier smaller than the dining rooms, but still absurdly ornate. An antique console table that probably cost more than most people's cars. I crossed to the front door and pulled it open. The man standing on the porch was somewhere in his late 40s, wearing a gray suit that had seen better days and carrying a leather messenger bag. He had the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him, unremarkable features, thinning hair, tired eyes, which was probably an asset in his line of work. Good evening, he said, his voice professionally neutral. I'm looking for Preston Mitchell. That would be my brother, I said, stepping aside so he could see into the house. Preston, you have a visitor. Preston had stopped in the archway between the dining room and foyer, one hand braced against the wall like he needed the support. His face had gone pale again, that grayish-white color that made him look sick. I'm Preston Mitchell, he said, and his voice came out thin and unsteady. The man stepped inside, reaching into his messenger bag. My name is Thomas. I'm a licensed process server in the state of Connecticut. He pulled out 2 manila envelopes, both official-looking with typed labels and red stamps. I have documents that require your signature. He held out the first envelope. Preston didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the envelope like it was a live grenade. You need to take it, Thomas said, not unkindly. That's how this works. Preston's hand shook as he reached out. The envelope looked small in his grip, but somehow heavy, like it weighed more than paper should. He stared at the label. Preston Mitchell re-FDA investigation notice. Case number 2-025-MD-08847. Compliance violation, medical device safety. What is this? Preston's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. It's explained in the documents, Thomas said. But in summary, You're being notified of a federal investigation into falsified medical device compliance reports. The Food and Drug Administration has flagged safety documentation submitted under your name 18 months ago. The documents in question pertain to cooling system specifications for temperature-sensitive medical equipment. Preston tore open the envelope with fumbling fingers. Inside was a thick stack of papers, the top sheet bearing the FDA seal and a case number. His eyes scanned the first paragraph, and I watched his face go from pale to something approaching green. He looked up at Thomas, then at me, then back at the papers. I don't know what this is. The documents detail specific violations. Thomas continued in that same neutral tone. Falsified temperature range data, forged quality control signatures, altered safety test results, all dated approximately 18 months ago and filed with the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. This is insane, Preston said, but there was no conviction in it. I'm not involved in the technical side of the business. You were, though. I spoke for the first time since opening the door, and everyone's attention snapped to me. 18 months ago. When you were desperate to prove to Dad that you could handle real responsibility, remember, you volunteered to oversee the FDA recertification process for our new cooling system. Preston's mouth opened-closed. You wanted it to go faster, I continued. The testing was taking too long, 12 weeks instead of the projected 8, and you were impatient. So you forged some documents, changed some numbers, signed off on tests that hadn't been completed, and you submitted everything to the FDA with your name on it. Preston started, then stopped. You knew about this. I found out 3 months ago, I said. When I was doing due diligence during the restructure, I pulled all our FDA records, and the discrepancies were obvious. Once you know what to look for, and you didn't say anything. His voice shot up, cracking. You knew I'd committed fraud, and you just what sat on it. I reported it, I said calmly. 2 weeks ago, to the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. But first, I fixed the problem. The cooling system had a genuine flaw, nothing catastrophic, but enough that it could have caused temperature excursions in storage. I redesigned the compressor integration, ran proper tests, and refiled all the documentation. Correctly this time. Warren had gone very still. Diane was gripping the back of a chair, her knuckles white. You see, I continued, I couldn't risk patient safety. If medical supplies had spoiled because of faulty equipment, people could have gotten sick, died even. So I fixed it. Made sure every hospital we work with had updated systems. Made sure the actual safety standards were met. I paused, let that sink in. And then I said, once the company was safe, once patients were safe, I reported what you'd done. But by that point, Preston, you'd already become the majority owner of the LLC, which means you're the one legally responsible for compliance violations committed under the company's name. Preston's hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the papers. You set me up. I protected patients, I corrected. And I made sure the person who committed fraud was the one who'd face consequences for it. That's not a setup. That's just timing. Thomas cleared his throat softly. Mr. Mitchell, I need your signature acknowledging receipt of these documents. Preston signed with a hand that trembled so violently his signature was barely legible. Thomas pulled out the second envelope, this one slightly thicker. There's one more, he said. Preston's hands were still shaking from the first envelope when Thomas held out the second. This one was thicker, the manila paper bulging slightly with whatever documents were folded inside. Preston took it like a man accepting his own death sentence, slowly, reluctantly, his fingers barely able to grip the edges. He tore it open. The sound of ripping paper seemed unnaturally loud in the foyer's silence. The top document was stamped in red across the header Emergency Injunction, Immediate Enforcement. Below it, in smaller but equally official text, Commercial Property Seizure Notice, Stamford Industrial Park, 847 West Main Street. What? Preston's voice cracked. He shuffled through the pages, his eyes scanning desperately. This says the landlord is seizing the facility, effective immediately. They can. Thomas said, his tone still professionally neutral. Emergency injunction was granted this afternoon by a Connecticut Superior Court judge. The landlord filed based on breach of lease terms and failure to maintain financial responsibility standards. Preston found the relevant page, his lips moving as he read. When he looked up, his face had gone gray again. Background check failure. He read aloud, his voice hollow. The new majority owner, that's me, has outstanding debts in excess of $1.5 million and is currently under federal investigation for fraud. He looked at me and there was something breaking in his eyes. You did this. You orchestrated all of this. I protected my company, I said. The landlord did his job. He ran a background check when ownership transferred like any responsible property owner would. What he found was someone drowning in debt and facing federal charges, so he exercised his right under the lease agreement to terminate and seize. The equipment, Preston said, and his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The inventory, everything in that building, belongs to the landlord now, I confirmed. As collateral against the $320,000 in penalties you owe him for breaking the lease. He'll probably auction it off. Might get 30-40 cents on the dollar if he's lucky. Preston's knees buckled. He didn't fall, not quite, but he caught himself against the wall, one hand braced on the expensive wallpaper, the other still clutching the injunction papers. Vanessa. His voice cracked on my name. Vanessa, please, please, I'll give you back the shares. I'll sign them over right now. Just stop this. Make it stop. I can't stop it, I said, and I kept my voice level, almost gentle. And you can't give me back shares. You never actually owned Preston. That's the point. You paid $450,000 for nothing. You mortgaged your house for air. And now you're personally liable for $1.8 million in debts under federal investigation for fraud, and you've lost access to the only physical asset you thought you had. I'll fix it! The words burst out of him desperate and loud enough to echo off the marble floors. I'll get a lawyer. I'll fight this. With what money? I asked quietly. That stopped him. His mouth opened closed. His breathing had gone ragged. Diane made a sound, a small, broken sob. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since Thomas had arrived. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged mascara tracking down her cheeks in thin black lines. Her hands were pressed against her mouth, like she was physically holding back words. You're destroying this family, she said, and her voice shook. Your own brother, your own father. You're destroying everything. The words hit something in my chest, something that had been building pressure for hours, for years. No mother, I thought, and the clarity of it was almost painful. You destroyed it when you chose him over me. Every single time. Every failure, he had you excused. Every success, I had you dismissed. You destroyed this family the moment you decided one child mattered more than the other. But I didn't say that. What came out was different. Colder, more final. I gave you 10 years, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. 10 years of being overlooked. 10 years of being belittled every time I visited, every time I tried to share good news, every time I hoped you might just once be proud of me instead of him. Diane's sob caught in her throat. 10 years of being erased, I continued, of watching you celebrate his failures as learning experiences while you questioned every decision I made, of listening to you tell your friends about Preston's entrepreneurial spirit while you introduced me as Vanessa. She's busy with work. Vanessa. Warren started, but I turned on him. And you, I said, you stood there at the head of this table tonight and called me too emotional to run a company. You, the man who nearly bankrupted his own business twice because you couldn't fire your incompetent friend. The man who spent 3 years stealing from me and convinced yourself it was somehow justified. Moi. Warren's face crumpled. He reached out one hand toward me, a gesture that might have been pleading or simply helpless. I always loved you, he said, and his voice was small now, stripped of all authority. I did. I wanted Preston to be strong, to be capable. I thought if I believed in him enough, you stole from me, Dad. The word dad came out harder than I intended, sharp-edged. $504,000, over 3 years. And you spend it on golf trips and cars and wine auctions instead of, I don't know, actually helping your son develop real skills. I can pay you back, Warren said desperately. We can work out a payment plan. I'll sell the house if I have to. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, I said. Jonathan Pierce. You remember him, the one who witnessed your signature on the trust documents. He'll be filing a civil suit for the full amount plus interest. The word lawsuit seemed to physically hit Warren. He swayed, then sank into one of the antique chairs near the console table, his head dropping into his hands. And that's when Preston moved. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't even coherent. It was pure desperation, a man with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for me, maybe to grab my arm, maybe to grab the tablet I'd left on the console table. I couldn't tell. Don't. The word came out of me sharp and cold, and I stepped back instinctively. My shoulders hit the doorframe behind me. Thomas moved too, sliding between Preston and me with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, dealt with people who got physical when served with papers they didn't want to accept. Mr. Mitchell, Thomas said, and his voice had changed, now less neutral, more authoritative. I need you to step back. Preston froze his hand, still outstretched, his face twisted into something I barely recognized. For a second, we just stood there, him lunging forward, me pressed against the doorframe. Thomas between us, Diane sobbing. Warren collapsed in the chair. Sienna standing perfectly still in the dining room archway with one hand on her belly and her eyes very wide. Then Preston's arm dropped. The fight went out of him all at once like someone had cut his strings. He slumped backward, catching himself on the wall again, and this time he slid down it until he was sitting on the marble floor, his back against the expensive wallpaper, the injunction papers scattered around him. He looked up at me, and there was nothing left in his face but exhaustion. Why, he asked. Just tell me why. I looked down at him. My brother sitting on the floor of our father's foyer, surrounded by legal documents that spelled out his destruction, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just a kind of cold, empty finality, because you tried to take everything I built, I said quietly, and I don't lose. Before I reveal what happens next, and trust me, you won't see this coming, drop the number 12 in the comments if you're still with me. Let me know you're here for the truth. And a quick reminder, the story ahead contains fictionalized elements. If intense family drama isn't for you, feel free to step away now, no hard feelings. The silence that followed my words lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Preston moved. It wasn't a lunge this time. It was something closer to a lurch, an uncoordinated scramble as he pushed himself up from the floor where he'd been sitting. His hand shot out toward me, or more specifically, toward the tablet I'd left on the console table behind me. I saw the desperation in the movement, the last gasp attempt of someone with nothing left to grab onto. He made it maybe 2 steps before Thomas moved. The process server didn't raise his voice, didn't make any aggressive gestures. He simply positioned himself between Preston and me with the kind of smooth, economical movement that spoke of experience, lots of it. One hand came up palm out, not quite touching Preston's chest, but close enough to make the boundary clear. "Mr. Mitchell," Thomas said, and his voice was still professionally neutral, but with an edge of steel underneath. "I'm going to need you to stop right there." Preston froze his arm, still extended his breath, coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Thomas's hand, at Thomas's face, and something in him seemed to crack a little more. His arm dropped. Then he turned wild-eyed and looked past Thomas to where Sienna stood in the dining room archway. "Sienna." His voice cracked on her name, shot through with panic and pleading. "Say something. Tell her she's insane. Tell her this is all insane." Sienna didn't answer, didn't move. She just stood there, one hand resting on her rounded belly, her face perfectly still. The silence stretched out, seconds ticking by on the grandfather clock down the hall, and I watched something shift in her expression, something subtle but unmistakable. Then very slowly she took her hand away from her belly and straightened. "Sienna," Preston said again, quieter this time, uncertain. She walked forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor with deliberate, measured steps. Not toward Preston. around the table along the edge of the foyer until she was standing beside me, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. The shift in spatial dynamics was immediate and visceral. Preston stared at her like he was watching a stranger wear his wife's face. Diane's voice cut through the silence, sharp with confusion. "Sienna, what are you doing?" Sienna didn't look at Diane. Her eyes were fixed on Preston, and there was something in her gaze I'd never seen before in all the months we'd worked together, all the family dinners and holidays and carefully staged moments. It was something cold and clear and utterly without mercy. She reached up with her left hand, the one wearing the platinum wedding band Preston had presented to her at that overpriced ceremony at the Delamar Greenwich Harbor, in front of 200 witnesses who'd eaten 5-tier cake and toasted the happy couple with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. Her fingers found the ring, twisted it, pulled it off with a small final tug. Then she held it up just for a moment so everyone could see it catch the light. The diamond engagement ring came with it 2 ring-stacked symbols of promises and futures, and the kind of forever that people said out loud in front of God and witnesses. She placed them on the console table next to where Thomas stood. The sound they made was small but sharp, a metallic clink that echoed in the foyer's high ceiling. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sienna turned to face Preston fully, and when she spoke, her voice was different. No tremor, no uncertainty, just cold, crystalline clarity. "Every single second I spent next to you," she said, each word perfectly enunciated, "made me want to vomit." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Diane made a small, shocked sound. Warren's head came up from where he'd been slumped in the chair, his face slack with confusion. Preston's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "What?" His voice came out, strangled barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Sienna's expression didn't change. "I'm talking about 8 months of pretending to find you charming when you're actually insufferable. 8 months of smiling through your self-important monologues about business strategies you don't understand. 8 months of listening to you explain things to me that I already know better than you ever will." Sienna, Preston took a step toward her and I saw Thomas shift slightly, ready to intervene again if needed. 8 months. Sienna continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling the space, of acting like I didn't notice you took credit for other people's ideas. Like I didn't see you blame everyone else when things went wrong. Like I didn't realize you've spent your entire life coasting on your parents' money and your last name and the kind of mediocre confidence that only privileged white men can sustain in the face of overwhelming evidence that they're actually terrible at everything they try. Diane's hand went to her mouth. Warren just stared, frozen. Preston was shaking his head over and over like he could physically dislodge the words from his understanding. You're not making sense. We're married. His eyes dropped to her belly, and something like hope flickered across his face. "You're pregnant. With my child. Our baby." "Am I?" Sienna's hand moved to her abdomen, pressed against the curve there. Her other hand reached down, fingers finding the hem of her emerald dress. Preston went very still. "What are you doing?" "Answering your question," Sienna said. She lifted the hem of her dress slightly, not much, just enough to reveal the bottom edge of her belly, and reached underneath. I heard Diane's sharp intake of breath, saw Warren lean forward despite himself, watched Preston's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, dawning horror. Sienna's hand moved, and there was a soft sound, Velcro releasing, or maybe elastic unsnapping, and then her fingers reappeared holding something. A strap. Medical-grade elastic, the kind used in prosthetics or support garments. She pulled it, and the fabric under her dress shifted in a way that fabric attached to a real body absolutely should not. "Oh my God," Diane whispered. Preston made a sound that wasn't quite a word. His hand came up, pointing at Sienna, trembling. "What is your not—" Sienna's voice cut through his stammering, cold and clear as glass. "Am I pregnant, Preston?" She asked the question like she was inquiring about the weather. "Really?" Her hand was still under her dress, still holding whatever apparatus she'd been using to simulate 8 months of pregnancy. The curve of her belly had already started to shift, to flatten slightly now that whatever was holding it in place had been loosened. Preston's face had gone the color of old newspaper. His mouth worked silently. Warren stood up from his chair, moving like a man in a dream. "Sienna, what are you saying?" But Sienna wasn't looking at Warren. She was looking at Preston, and there was something in her eyes that might have been pity, except pity was too soft a word for something that sharp. "Let me show you," she said, and her hand moved again, pulling upward. The prosthetic belly came away from Sienna's body with a soft, final sound fabric, releasing elastic, giving up, and suddenly she was holding it in both hands, not cradling it, not protecting it, just holding it, this beige medical-grade thing shaped like 8 months of pregnancy, complete with texture ridges and realistic weight distribution. For one suspended moment, she just looked at it. Then she turned and threw it. It landed on the dining table with a hollow thud, not heavy, not substantial, just empty and rolled slightly before settling among the remains of Thanksgiving dinner. The cranberry sauce, the half-carved turkey, the autumn centerpiece that Diane had probably spent hours arranging. And now in the middle of it all, a prosthetic pregnant belly, its Velcro strap still dangling. Diane's hands flew to her mouth, her gasp sharp enough to cut glass. Warren's fork, which he'd been holding in some kind of paralyzed grip this entire time, clattered onto his plate with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. Nobody moved. Sienna stood there, her dress hanging differently now, flat across her abdomen, where before there had been that pronounced curve. Her hand went to her stomach, pressed against the fabric, and there was nothing. No bump. No baby. Just a slim, athletic frame that had been hidden under careful tailoring and strategic illusion for months. "There is no baby," Sienna said, and her voice was steady, clear, almost gentle in its finality. "There never was." Preston made a sound like something breaking inside him. Not quite a word, not quite a sob, just air escaping something that had been holding pressure for too long. "No," he whispered, and the word came out fractured, barely held together. "No, we've been married a year." He couldn't seem to finish the sentence, couldn't find words for what he was trying to say. "We've been married a year," Sienna agreed. "Well, 11 months and 3 weeks to be precise. And during that time, I spent approximately 40% of my nights at your house. The rest I stayed at my own apartment in Norwalk. I told you it was because I needed space, because pregnancy made me uncomfortable, because your mattress was too firm." She paused. "You never questioned it." "But the doctor appointments," Preston said desperately. "The ultrasounds. You saw printouts from the internet," Sienna said. "Stock images of ultrasounds I told you were ours. You never actually came to an appointment with me, Preston. Every time I scheduled one, you had a meeting, or a golf game, or you were too busy planning your corporate takeover." Diane was shaking her head over and over like she could physically dislodge reality. "This can't, Sienna. We threw you a baby shower. I gave you gifts," Sienna finished, "which I donated to a women's shelter in Stamford. I'm sure they appreciated the designer onesies and the $600 stroller." Warren found his voice rough and bewildered. "Who are you?" Sienna turned to face him, and I watched her shoulders square, not defensively, but with the kind of confidence that came from no longer having to pretend. "That's a good question," I said, and I stepped forward slightly, just enough to draw everyone's attention. "Preston, I don't think you've ever been properly introduced. This is Sienna Reeves, corporate forensic investigator licensed in Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts. Former special agent with the FBI's white-collar crimes unit, where she worked asset forfeiture and fraud cases for 8 years before going private." Preston's mouth opened, closed. His face had gone beyond pale into something translucent. "I hired her 2 years ago," I continued. "The retainer was $250,000. Her job was simple: get close to you, document everything you did, and help me build a legal case that would protect my company from whatever you and Dad were planning." "You—" Preston's voice cracked. He looked at Sienna, then at me, then back at Sienna. "You paid her to investigate you," I said, "to gather evidence, to be ready for exactly what happened tonight." Sienna reached into the small clutch she'd been carrying all evening, the cream Bottega Veneta that matched her dress, and pulled out her phone. "I've recorded every conversation we've had in the past year. she said, her tone matter-of-fact, almost clinical. "Every dinner where you talked about how you deserved more than Vanessa. Every time you complained that your parents favored her. Every planning session with Warren about how you'd take over the company." She swiped through her phone, the screen reflecting in her eyes. "I've documented every financial transaction. Every time you maxed out a credit card and asked me to spot you cash. Every payment your parents made to cover your debts. Every lie you told about where money was going." Preston was shaking his head, that same repetitive motion Diane had been making, like denial could somehow rewrite reality. This can't be real. You're my wife. We're married. You love me." Sienna's expression didn't change. "I've never loved you, Preston. I don't even like you. You're entitled, incompetent, and you blame everyone but yourself for every failure you've experienced. You're exhausting to be around, and frankly, this year has been one of the most professionally challenging of my career, and I've worked undercover in Ponzi schemes." The words landed like physical blows. Preston actually staggered, one hand reaching out for the wall. "Every moment with you," Sienna continued, her voice never rising, never wavering, "was work. Every smile was an act. Every conversation where I pretended to be impressed by your business ideas you stole from LinkedIn posts or half remembered from podcasts, was me doing my job." "Stop," Diane said, her voice strangled. "Stop talking. Just stop." But Sienna wasn't done. She looked at me, and I saw something pass between us, acknowledgement maybe, or just the recognition of a job completed. "And 3 months ago," Sienna said, turning her attention back to Preston, "when I discovered your FDA fraud, the forged safety documents, the falsified testing reports, I reported it. Not to Vanessa first, to the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. I made the call myself." She held up her phone, and I could see the call log on the screen from across the space. "August 16th, she said. 2:30 in the afternoon. I spoke with Special Agent Jennifer Morrison for 47 minutes. I provided her with photographs of the documents' detailed notes about the timeline, and my professional opinion as someone with federal law enforcement experience that the fraud was deliberate and systematic." Preston's knees gave out. He didn't slide down the wall this time, he just dropped, landing hard on the marble floor, his head dropping into his hands. Diane made a high keening sound. Warren was staring at Sienna like she'd grown horns. "You set this up?" Diane managed finally, her voice shaking with rage or grief or some combination of both. "Both of you planned this. You're monsters." "We're practical," I said. "There's a difference." Sienna's phone was still in her hand screen, glowing. "Would you like to see the recordings?" she asked, and it wasn't really a question. "I have 47 hours of audio, 18 hours of video, 312 photographs of financial documents, text messages, and emails, 89 PDF files of scanned paperwork." She started swiping through folders, and I could see the organization even from where I stood, dates, categories, tags. "I can show you the conversation from March where Preston told me he was going to take what's his from Vanessa," Sienna said. "Or the dinner in June where Warren explained how they'd structure the ownership transfer to minimize taxes. Or the night in September when Preston practiced his announcement speech in our bedroom mirror." She looked up, met Preston's devastated gaze. "I have everything," she said simply. "Every word, every lie, every moment you thought you were winning." Sienna held out her phone, the screen bright in the dim foyer light. I could see it from where I stood. The organized folders, the file counts, everything labeled and categorized with the kind of precision that came from years of building federal cases. 47 audio recordings, she said, her voice still that same clinical calm. Organized by date and participant. "Here's one from March 14th, Preston, telling me over dinner that he was going to take what's rightfully his from his little sister who doesn't appreciate what she has." She swiped to another folder. 312 photographs, financial documents, text messages, emails. "Here's Warren in June texting Preston about how to structure the ownership transfer to minimize capital gains tax, which, by the way, is also tax fraud, since you were planning to claim the company was worth less than it actually was." Another swipe. 89 PDF files, scanned contracts, bank statements, invoices, including these. She zoomed in on a document. Warren's fake consulting invoices. Every single one with timestamps showing when he created them, usually the night before he submitted them to Medicorp's accounting system. Warren made a small choked sound. Diane was staring at the phone like it was a weapon. And this, Sienna continued pulling up what looked like a video file, is from September 23rd. Preston in our bedroom practicing his announcement speech. The one he was planning to give tonight. He rehearsed it 6 times. I recorded all of them. She looked at Preston, who was still on the floor, his back against the wall, his face buried in his hands. Connecticut is a single-party consent state, she said, which means I only needed my own permission to record any conversation I was part of. Every audio file, every video, every photograph I took of documents you showed me, all of it is admissible in court. All of it is legal evidence. The word evidence seemed to echo in the space. Preston's shoulders shook. The sound that came out of him was something between a sob and a laugh, high and broken. Why, he asked, and his voice was so small it barely carried across the foyer. He looked up at me, and his face was wrecked, red-eyed, tear-stained, utterly destroyed. Why would you do this to me? I looked at him for a long moment. My brother, 37 years old, sitting on the marble floor of our father's mansion, surrounded by the wreckage of every lie he'd ever told himself about who he was and what he deserved. Then I walked over and knelt down slowly until we were at eye level. Because you tried to take everything I built, I said quietly, and I don't lose. The words were simple, final. I watched them land, watched something in Preston's expression crack a little more. I stood up my knees, making a small sound on the marble, turned to face Warren and Diane, who were still frozen in that tableau of shock and denial. Lose my number, I said, both of you. Warren's hand came up, reaching toward me, the gesture helpless and desperate. Vanessa, please, we can work this out. We're family. No, I interrupted, and the word came out sharp and clean. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't erase each other. Family doesn't spend 34 years making one child invisible so the other one can pretend to be special. I took a breath, felt something settle in my chest, something that felt like the end of a very long, very heavy chapter. You're not my family, I said. Not anymore. You're strangers. Strangers who stole from me, lied to me, and tried to destroy something I built from nothing. So yes, Warren, lose my number. Delete my contact. Forget you ever had a daughter, since you've been pretty good at that for the past 10 years anyway. Diane made a sound, a sharp indrawn breath that might have been a gasp or might have been the beginning of words she couldn't quite form. Then she found her voice, and when it came out, it was ugly with rage. You'll regret this, she spat, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. You'll regret throwing away your family for what money pride you're going to end up alone, Vanessa. Completely alone. No husband, no children, no one who gives a damn about you. And when you're old and bitter and realize what you've done, we won't be there. We won't care. The words were meant to hurt, to cut, to find whatever soft place was left in me and tear it open. I looked at my mother, at this woman who'd given birth to me and then spent 3 decades treating me like an afterthought, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pain, just a kind of cold, clear certainty. I'd rather be alone, I said quietly, than be invisible. The silence that followed was absolute. Then I turned to Sienna, who'd been standing quietly this whole time, phone still in hand, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes, when I caught them, holding something like pride. Ready, I asked. Ready, she confirmed. We walked toward the front door together. I could feel their eyes on my back, Warren's bewildered, Diane's furious, Preston's broken. Thomas, the process server, stepped aside, professionally giving us space. My coat was still hanging by the door where I'd left it hours ago, back when this had been just another Thanksgiving dinner. I pulled it on a black wool Burberry that I'd bought myself 3 years ago with my first real profit check, and buttoned it slowly. Sienna did the same with her own coat, a camel cashmere that had probably cost as much as the prosthetic belly she'd just thrown on the dining table. I opened the door. The November night air hit me immediately cold and sharp and clean. I could see our breath, could see the frost already forming on the perfectly manicured lawn, could see the lights of Greenwich spread out below us. the kind of wealthy Connecticut suburb where everyone had money and no one talked about where it came from. Behind me, I heard movement. Warren may be taking a step forward, or Diane unable to let me have the last word. I didn't turn around. Sienna and I stepped out onto the porch and I pulled the door closed behind us with a soft final click that sounded louder than it should have. We walked down the front steps together, our heels clicking in unison on the stone. My car, a practical Volvo SUV that I'd chosen for safety ratings and cargo space, not status, was parked in the circular driveway next to Preston's leased BMW and my parents' matching Lexuses. I unlocked it with a soft beep. Sienna walked to the passenger side without a word. We got in. I started the engine. The dashboard lit up familiar and steady. Through the windshield, I could see the mansion, the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned that love was conditional and attention was something you earned and failed to earn in equal measure. Warm light glowed from the windows, and for a moment I could see figures moving inside. Then the porch light clicked off, and the scene went dark. I put the car in drive. 1 month later, the lights of Boston spread out below me like a constellation brought down to earth, the financial district's towers glowing against the December night. The harbor barely visible as a dark ribbon threading through the city, the Zakim Bridge lit up in the distance with its signature white cables. From the 28th floor of one financial center, the view was the kind that real estate agents called breathtaking and charged accordingly for. And tonight, with the office windows reflecting both the city and the warm light from inside, it felt almost unreal. Medicor Innovations Incorporated had moved into this space 3 weeks ago. The lease signing had been one of those moments that felt simultaneously momentous and mundane. Jonathan Pierce had handled the paperwork I'd signed, about 40 pages. And then suddenly we had 12,000 square feet of modern office space, with exposed ductwork polished concrete floors, and enough natural light during the day that we barely needed the industrial pendant fixtures hanging from the ceiling. Tonight, though, the pendant lights were on, casting a warm glow over what had become an impromptu Friendsgiving celebration. I'd learned about Friendsgiving from Elena, actually. She'd mentioned it casually a few weeks back, how her friend group in Cambridge always did a friend Thanksgiving the weekend after the actual holiday, since most of them couldn't afford to fly home or didn't particularly want to. When I'd suggested we do something similar for the team, her face had lit up in a way that made me realize I'd stumbled onto something that mattered. It's like Thanksgiving, she'd explained, but with people you actually like. Which was how, on a Thursday evening in late December, because November had been too raw, too recent, too full of paperwork and lawyers and the systematic dismantling of my biological family, we'd ended up with 15 people, $300 worth of catered food from a Turkish restaurant in Somerville, and enough wine to make everyone comfortable without crossing into unprofessional. The turkey had been carved on the communal table we'd set up in the open area near the windows. The sides roasted vegetable stuffing that was somehow both crispy and soft. Mashed potatoes with actual lumps, because apparently that meant they were real, were spread out in a buffet line that people had been circulating through for the past hour. Wine bottles stood open at intervals red and white, and someone, I think Michelle, had brought a playlist that was currently playing what I recognized as Bon Iver, though I couldn't have named the song. Sienna stood by the windows talking to Marcus Carter, who'd driven up from Connecticut specifically for this. She looked different without the prosthetic belly, without the careful performance she'd maintained for a year. Smaller somehow, though that might have just been the contrast. Tonight she wore slim black pants and a charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail, and when she laughed at something, Marcus said it was genuine. No performance, no calculation, just actual amusement. Elena was near the food table explaining something animatedly to two of the junior developers, her hands moving in quick gestures that suggested she was either describing a technical problem or telling a story. She was 28, brilliant in the way that made investors lean forward during pitch meetings. And she'd turned down offers from Google and Amazon to stay with Medicor because, in her words, I'd rather build something real than optimize ad delivery for billionaires. Michelle, our supply chain manager, was sitting on one of the modern sofas we'd bought for the lounge area, her shoes kicked off, talking to James from logistics. She was 24, fresh out of UMass Amherst with a degree in operations management, and she had the kind of attention to detail that meant shipments arrived on time and clients stayed happy. She told me last week that this was the first job where she felt like her ideas actually mattered. And I'd had to take a moment in my office afterward because the comment had hit me harder than I expected. The other 12 people scattered around the space were a mix: engineers, account managers, operations staff. The kind of team you built carefully over years when you cared about culture as much as competence. Most of them were young, late 20s to early 30s, the kind of people who'd chosen startup risk over corporate stability because they wanted to do work that meant something. I stood near the windows, holding a glass of wine I'd barely touched, and watched them. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the forced performances of blood relation where you showed up because you were expected to and endured because leaving would cause drama. Not the conditional love that came with strings attached and expectations you could never quite meet. Not the hierarchy where some children mattered more than others, where success was dismissed and failure was weaponized. This was chosen. This was earned. This was real. The laughter that rose from the sofa where Michelle and James sat wasn't polite or careful. It was genuine, the kind that made other people look over and smile even if they didn't know the joke. The conversation Sienna and Marcus were having by the windows was animated. Marcus gesturing with his wine glass in a way that suggested he was making a point about business, while Sienna nodded and occasionally interjected with what I knew from experience would be sharp, practical insights. Elena caught my eye from across the room and raised her champagne flute, not the wine most people were drinking, but actual champagne. Veuve Clicquot that she'd brought herself with a grin and a comment about celebrating properly. I raised my wine glass in return, and she smiled the kind of smile that was equal parts professional respect and genuine warmth. Then she set down her champagne, said something to the developers she'd been talking to, and walked over. "Boss," she said when she reached me, and I'd long since given up trying to get her to call me Vanessa. Elena had worked in enough Silicon Valley-adjacent environments to have opinions about hierarchy and formality, and boss was apparently her compromise between respect and accessibility. "Can I borrow you for a second?" "Of course," I said, and followed her toward one of the smaller conference rooms we'd set up along the interior wall, glass-fronted, soundproofed, with whiteboards and those aggressively ergonomic chairs that cost $300 each and were supposedly worth it. She closed the door behind us, muffling the sounds of the party to a pleasant background hum. Through the glass, I could still see everyone, the warm glow, the movement, the life of it all. Elena turned to face me, and there was something in her expression that made me straighten slightly. Not concern exactly, but seriousness. "Everything okay?" I asked. She smiled. "Everything's great, actually. I just wanted to give you an update on something before it becomes official tomorrow." Elena closed the door behind us, and the sounds of the party laughter conversations, the soft jazz and indie mix that Michelle had put together, faded to a pleasant background hum. Through the glass walls, I could see everyone, Sienna gesturing animatedly while Marcus nodded, two of the engineers arguing good-naturedly about something technical, Michelle refilling her wine glass. "So," Elena said, turning to face me with an expression that was equal parts professional and excited. The way she looked when code compiled on the first try or a particularly elegant solution presented itself. "3 things. First, the new cooling system." I felt my shoulders tense slightly, not with worry exactly, but with that automatic brace that came from months of dealing with the FDA fraud situation Preston had created. Elena must have caught it because her smile widened. It passed," she said simply. "Not just passed, sailed through. The FDA inspector who came last week said it was one of the most thoroughly documented systems she'd reviewed in 5 years. We got full approval yesterday afternoon. The certification paperwork should be finalized by Monday." The irony wasn't lost on me. Preston had forged documents to fake approval for a flawed system. I'd fixed the actual flaw, documented everything properly, and now we had genuine approval for technology that actually worked. Sometimes karma wasn't poetic, it was just thorough. "That's incredible," I said, and meant it. "How's the team feeling?" "Relieved," Elena admitted. I know most of them didn't know the full story about what happened with Preston, but they knew we were under extra scrutiny. Getting that approval, it feels like validation, like we're doing something real. We are doing something real, I said. That's the point. Elena's grin softened into something more genuine. Yeah, I know. Which brings me to number 2, Series B, officially closed this morning. $28 million at an $85 million valuation. All the paperwork is signed. The wire transfers cleared. We're funded. I'd known it was coming. Jonathan had called me yesterday to confirm the final investor signatures, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way that paperwork hadn't. $28 million, not from my parents, not from some inheritance or family connection. From investors who'd looked at our technology, our team, our growth trajectory, and decided we were worth betting on. Who's the lead? I asked. Kleiner Perkins, Elena said. With secondary participation from GV, Google Ventures and Lux Capital, Marcus's recommendation apparently carried a lot of weight. He personally vouched for our supply chain reliability in the investor meetings. Marcus, of course. The man had driven 2 hours tonight to be here, had taken calls from me at 8 in the morning and 10 at night. Had never once treated me like I was wasting his time, even when I was a nobody running a medical supply company out of a warehouse in Stamford. Remind me to thank him properly, I said. I think he'd settle for another glass of wine, Elena said. But there's more. Third thing, we signed 3 new contracts in the past 2 weeks. Big ones. She pulled out her phone, swiped to a document, and turned it toward me. I recognized the logos immediately. Amazon, she said, pointing to the first. Their healthcare division. They're launching a new prescription delivery service, and they need temperature-controlled logistics. We're their primary partner for the Northeast Corridor. Initial contract is for 18 months, but there's an option to expand nationally if the pilot goes well. She scrolled down. Walgreens. They're upgrading their cold chain infrastructure for vaccine distribution, especially with all the new mRNA stuff that's temperature sensitive. We're supplying the monitoring systems and handling integration with their existing network. 3-year contract option to extend. Another scroll. And Kaiser Permanente. They're building out a specialty pharmacy division focused on biologics. We're their equipment vendor and will be training their staff on proper handling protocols. 5-year contract with a guaranteed minimum order volume that... She looked up and her eyes were actually gleaming. That basically triples our projected revenue for next year. I stared at the logos on her phone. Amazon, Walgreens, Kaiser Permanente, the kind of clients that legitimized a company that turned promising startup into industry player. When do these go public? I asked. Monday, Elena said. Press releases are already drafted. PR firm is ready to distribute. Marcus wanted to be the one to tell you before it became official, but he got caught up talking to Sienna, and I figured you should know tonight. I nodded, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. In the span of a month, we'd gone from me standing in my parents' foyer watching my brother collapse to this a fully funded company with Fortune 500 clients and FDA approval for technology that actually saved lives. You did this, I said quietly. You and the team. We did this, Elena corrected. You built the foundation, Vanessa. You made the calls when it would have been easier to give up. You protected the company when your own family was trying to destroy it. She gestured vaguely toward the party visible through the glass. We're just following the path you cleared. There was a soft knock on the glass. We both turned to see Michelle standing outside, her hand raised in a small wave. Elena opened the door. Sorry to interrupt, Michelle said, though her expression suggested she wasn't particularly sorry. But I figured you should know I saw Preston last week. The shift in my chest was immediate but not painful, just present. Like touching an old bruise and finding it no longer hurt. At Home Depot, Michelle continued, the one on West Main Street in Stamford. He was at the customer service desk filling out an application. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked... She paused, clearly searching for the right word. Smaller, somehow. Elena glanced at me, her expression carefully neutral. I hope he gets the job, I said, and I was mildly surprised to find I meant it. Not because I forgave him, not because what he'd done was somehow okay now, but because everyone deserved the chance to rebuild, even if they'd destroyed themselves trying to tear someone else down. Michelle's eyebrows rose. You're kinder than I would be. If my brother had tried to steal my company, She made a vague gesture that suggested something significantly less charitable than hoping for gainful employment. I'm not kind, I said, and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones with a clarity that was almost startling. I'm just free. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they landed with weight. Michelle looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, she said, I can see that. Before I could respond, Sienna appeared in the doorway, a wine glass in each hand, and that knowing look she got when she decided it was time for something to happen. Can I steal her for a toast? She asked Elena and Michelle, though the question was clearly rhetorical. Absolutely, Elena said. We were just finishing up. Sienna handed me one of the wine glasses, read a Malbec if I was reading the color right, and gestured toward the main area where the party was still in full swing. Come on, she said, it's time. We walked out of the conference room together, and I felt the shift as we moved from private space back into the collective energy of the gathering. Sienna raised her voice slightly, not quite shouting, but enough to cut through the conversations. Everyone, she called out. Can we get everyone together for a minute? Vanessa has something to say. I didn't actually, but Sienna was already corralling people toward the area near the windows, and Elena was gently shepherding the engineers away from whatever technical debate they'd been having. And within 30 seconds, everyone was gathering 15 people with wine glasses and champagne flutes, and in one case, a beer someone had brought from home. They looked at me expectantly. I realized I was supposed to give a toast. I raised my glass and the conversations around me quieted, not all at once, but in that organic way that happens when people sense something is about to be said. 15 faces turned toward me, backlit by the Boston skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I looked at them, Elena with her champagne, Michelle with her kicked-off shoes, and genuine smile. Sienna leaning against the window frame with that professional ease she wore now that she didn't have to pretend. Marcus, holding his wine glass like he was settling in to listen, and the words came. A year ago, I said, and my voice carried clearly in the sudden quiet, I thought I'd lost everything, my family, my company, everything I'd spent a decade building. I paused, let that sit for a beat. Turns out, I continued, and I felt a smile pull at the corner of my mouth. I just lost the wrong people. The laughter that followed was warm and knowing the kind that said everyone in this room understood exactly what I meant. Sienna raised her glass slightly and added her voice, carrying just enough to be heard, and gained the right ones. More laughter. Someone, I think it was one of the junior developers, said, "Hear, hear." I looked around the room again, taking in the faces, these people who'd chosen to be here, who'd turned down bigger salaries and more prestigious names because they wanted to build something that mattered. This company exists, I said, because you believed in the mission, not in the name on the door. Because you showed up every day and did work that saves lives. Because you gave a damn. I raised my glass higher. Thank you, all of you. The toast that followed was enthusiastic glasses, raised people calling out cheers, and to Medicore, and from Marcus, a booming to Vanessa that made me laugh despite myself. The sound of glass clinking against glass filled the space warm and genuine. As people started to disperse back into smaller conversations, Elena drifted over Michelle in tow. So, Elena said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp with curiosity. I've been wondering, what actually happened with your family? She gestured vaguely. I know some of it from news articles and the FDA stuff, but Preston's company declared bankruptcy 2 weeks ago. I said, keeping my voice matter of fact. The LLC, the one he thought he owned. It had too much debt and no assets. The court appointed a trustee to liquidate what little was left. Ouch, Michelle said. My father is facing a civil lawsuit for embezzlement, I continued. My attorney, Jonathan Pierce, same one who witnessed the trust documents, filed in early December. Warren took over $500,000 from me over 3 years through fake consulting fees. We're asking for the full amount plus interest and legal fees. Elena's eyebrows rose. And your mother, Filed for divorce from my father, I said. Mid-December. I don't know the details, but I'm guessing she finally realized he was broke and facing legal consequences she didn't want to be attached to. There was a moment of silence, and I could see both of them trying to figure out if I was okay, if this was painful to talk about. I'm fine, I said, and I meant it. They made their choices. I made mine. Sienna wandered over, having apparently caught the tail end of the conversation. For what it's worth, she said, I'm back to consulting full-time. Though I occasionally do compliance work for Medicor when Vanessa needs someone to review contracts or vet new partners. So, you're still working together, Michelle said, and there was something approving in her tone. That's actually kind of perfect. What about the money? Elena asked suddenly. The $450,000 Preston borrowed. Did he ever? The bank foreclosed on his house, I said. Took possession in late November. Sienna's name wasn't on the fraudulent mortgage Preston forged her signature, remember, so she wasn't liable. The bank sold the property, recouped part of what they were owed, and wrote off the rest as a loss. And Preston, Michelle asked quietly. Last I heard he was applying for retail work, and I said, Home Depot, it's honest work, maybe it'll be good for him. There was another pause, and then Elena asked the question. I could see she'd been holding back. Do you ever think about reaching out to any of them? I thought about that. About Warren's face the last time I'd seen him slumped in that antique chair. About Diane's fury. About Preston sitting on the marble floor with legal documents scattered around him. No, I said finally. They're not my family anymore. You are. The words came out simpler than I'd intended, but they landed with weight. Elena's expression softened. Michelle's eyes went a little bright. Before anyone could respond, before the moment could get too heavy, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Cream-colored, expensive paper, my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized. Actually, I said, there is one more thing. I hold the envelope, feeling its weight. The paper is thick, cream-colored linen, the kind Warren always used for important correspondence. My name is written across the front in his precise script. Navy blue ink, no return address. It arrived last Tuesday, forwarded through Jonathan Pierce's office with a note. Your father requested I pass this along. You are under no obligation to respond. I slide my thumb under the flap and pull out a single folded sheet. The first line stops me. Dear Vanessa, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm writing this from my therapist's office because she says I need to take accountability. I stop reading. I fold the letter carefully and slide it back into the envelope. I don't need to read the rest. I already know what it says, some version of, I'm sorry I was wrong. Please give me another chance. Maybe he means it. Maybe he's changed. But I don't owe him the benefit of the doubt. I turn back toward the group. They've been watching quietly, giving me space. Sienna holds 2 glasses of wine, her expression patient. Elena leans against the window, waiting. Michelle perches on the conference table. My father wrote this, I say, holding up the envelope. I haven't decided if I'll answer. Sienna steps closer, offering me a glass. Do you want to forgive him? I take the wine, let the question settle. I don't know, I say slowly. Part of me wants to believe people can change. Part of me knows that some bridges burn for a reason. Elena pushes off the window. You don't owe him anything, boss. I know. I look down at the envelope, then back at her. And that's the freedom, isn't it, I get to choose. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, just choice. Michelle slides off the table, picks up her glass. Then let's drink to that. She raises it high. To choice. Sienna lifts hers. To choice. Elena grins. To choice. One by one, the rest of the team joins in. To choice. I raise mine last, and the sound of crystal meeting crystal fills the room. I walk back to the windows and look out at the city. Boston stretches below us 28 stories down. The Hancock Tower catches the light. The Zokim Bridge glows blue-white against the night. Snow begins to fall, soft flakes drifting through streetlights, settling on rooftops. I press my palm against the cold glass and think back. 10 years ago, I was 24, signing a $75,000 loan with my father's name on the co-signer line. I remember the cold floors of that Stamford warehouse, the smell of cardboard and cleaner, the first hospital contract, $18,000. I remember thinking, if I can do this, I can do anything. And I did. Tonight I'm standing in an office I built surrounded by people who chose to be here. People who believe in what we're building, not because of my last name, but because they see the work. Preston wanted to take this from me. He thought if he controlled the company, he could control me. He never understood that it was never about the company. It was about proving I could build a life where I wasn't invisible, where I mattered not because of my family's name, but because of my work, my integrity, my refusal to give up. Warren will face his lawsuit. Preston will rebuild or he won't. Diane will find a new target for her disappointment. The world will keep turning. And me, I'll keep building. I'll keep choosing people who see me for who I am. I'll keep showing up for the family I made, not the one I was born into. Because sometimes the family you choose is the one that saves you. And sometimes saving yourself is the bravest thing you can do. Behind me, laughter rises again. Marcus is telling a story about a factory tour gone wrong. Elena's doubled over, Sienna's grinning. Michelle's pouring more wine. I turn away from the window and walk back. The envelope stays on the ledge, out of sight, out of reach. Maybe I'll answer it someday. Maybe I won't. But tonight, I don't need to decide. Tonight, I'm exactly where I want to be. The snow keeps falling soft and silent. Inside, the office glows with light and warmth and joy that comes from being surrounded by people who chose you. I step into the circle. Elena loops her arm through mine. Sienna hands me a fresh glass. Marcus raises his in another toast, and we all laugh. The camera pulls back slowly, cinematically capturing all of us. 15 people crowded into a corner office on the 28th floor. Glasses raised, faces bright. The Boston skyline glittering behind us. I smile wide and real. For the first time in my life, I don't feel the weight of proving myself. I don't feel invisible. I just feel whole. And to you, listening to this story, remember this: God sees what people overlook. When I went through family betrayal, I felt invisible inside my own home. But sometimes family betrayal reveals something important. It shows you who truly stands with you. Every moment I was ignored or dismissed, God was quietly reminding me that my worth was never meant to come from their approval. It comes from Him. Walking away from that house, I finally understood the meaning of Proverbs: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Not in bloodlines, not in last names. When you face family betrayal, the hardest step is letting go of the illusion that family must always stand beside you. Sometimes faith becomes the only steady ground you have. For a long time, I thought the answer to family betrayal was family revenge. I spent years gathering proof planning responses and protecting myself from the people who hurt me. And yes, in many ways, the truth came out and the balance shifted. But here is the truth. Most people do not talk about family revenge can never return the years you spent fighting. That is why my advice is simple. Protect yourself if you must. Stand up when you face family betrayal, but do not let family revenge become the center of your life. Because the opposite of family revenge is not weakness, it is freedom. Freedom means building a life with people who choose you back. It means creating a family defined by loyalty, honesty, and peace, not just blood. My father is working on himself. My brother is learning humility. And me, I am surrounded by the people who truly stand with me. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might help someone else facing family betrayal find the courage to move forward.